Good morning, I'm WaywornWyrm, and welcome to my channel. And welcome back to Hoard of the Dragon Queen, Episode 13, Raiding the Camp. The party eventually decided to stay in town the rest of that day and the entire next day, but then they would head back to the raiders' camp. When they met back up on the morning that they were going to leave, several looks were given to Garrett, who had given up his short sword in favor of a much longer one. When the looks had finished, Garrett shrugged. "What? I've been training for a long time with a longer sword. My training for it completed recently, and I managed to buy a longsword yesterday." Flintfinder laughed at his small friend. "Fair enough, Garrett. As long as this doesn't hinder you, then that is great." After that short exchange, they left the keep and walked through the town in high spirits. Although it was still only 4 days since the attack, they could see people rebuilding. The farmers, of course, were out tending to their fields, and the mill was running again. Other than those two professions, every able-bodied person was working in crews to clear everything that had been destroyed, while others were starting to rebuild houses. Those who had houses, or the few whose houses had already been rebuilt in the last couple of days, were housing who they could, while the temple and the keep were housing the rest. As they neared the edge of town, the party noticed one work crew that was dedicated to digging the dry moat that would eventually surround the town. Then, with very little fanfare, they were out in the green fields, moving toward the camp they had visited just a couple days before. Knowing which way to go, and not having anyone to try and slip past or fight, sped up their journey considerably, and they neared the camp around midday. And the moment they saw the camp, they knew something had changed. The area that the kobold camp had been on was completely burned to the ground, and there seemed to be no sign of life on the mostly intact upper camp either. The guard towers were still there, but they appeared to be unmanned. "The small fires we started the other night should never have gotten so out of control that they did all this," Morn said gravely. "Either the cult was completely incompetent, or, and I believe this is far more likely, they left and burned the camp behind them. Let's skirt the camp against the walls of the plateau and try and sneak into the cave. They might have some guards staying behind," Garrett suggested. The party was in agreement with him and attempted to sneak their way toward the camp. On the way, there were several times when Flintfinder was having trouble, but Morin expertly helped him out to stay quiet and out of sight of the cave entrance. As they made their way closer, they noticed 4 humans sitting around a small fire cooking some small game. They were clearly dressed as hunters, and as they noticed the party, they either ignored them or made a small gesture of acknowledgement before going back to their meal. They did not seem too interested in the cult's business. By the time they'd made their way to the entrance of the cave, they had noticed there were 2 humans standing inside, clearly on guard, and clearly trying to blend in with their surroundings, if not to be completely invisible. These 2 humans didn't seem to notice the approaching party. Garrett made his move first, quietly drawing his sword and attacking with fury. His sword blow sliced across the chest of the guard, splitting some of the leather armor. Then he put a swift kick to the back of the guard's knee, causing them to drop to one knee. Quora sent a firebolt at the guard as Garrett had attacked and hit them. It caused the guard to fall back, but somehow they managed to stay alive and, at least theoretically, ready to fight. Drawing his swords, Flintfinder ran after Garrett and attacked the other guard that was currently unattended to. The guard was able to use his scimitar to block Flintfinder's short sword, but was apparently not used to, or trained to deal with, an opponent with 2 weapons, and left themselves wide open for Flintfinder's longsword to slice deep into their ribs on the side. Mara rushed to help Garrett and came in with a huge swing of her mace. Unfortunately, she telegraphed her attack a little too much, as the guard was able to block it even as they struggled to find their feet. What the guard didn't count on was Mara calling down a beam of blazing light as they blocked her mace. They were burned to death by the sacred light. Morn shot a mote of fire at the remaining guard, who went up in a blaze and collapsed dead. Knowing that there were some guards in the cave, it became clear that there was something still in this cave, and they decided to proceed with caution. As they moved their way back into the cave, it ended in a 10-foot drop-off. Broad steps were roughly hewn into a natural ramp as into a cavern carpeted with fungus ranging from a few inches high to nearly as tall as an adult human. 2 paths led through the fungi, one to the right and one to the left. "Which should we take?" Morn asked as he looked first at the 2 paths and then to his companions. "Well, my grandfather always said good adventurers always go left. I don't see why we can't follow that wisdom," Cora said with a shrug. It didn't seem to make much of a difference, at least not up here. "Left it is, then," Flintfinder said with no objections. They began to descend the steps cautiously. Kobolds, after all, had a reputation as being cave dwellers who loved to set traps everywhere. It would be a safe bet that the cult would keep some kobolds around to do the manual work that they would not want to do themselves, so there was a decent chance there were some sort of trap. When they had almost reached the bottom, Tess put her arms out to hold up the group. "Wait a second. There's something not right about these steps. It looks like one false move and they would collapse. Let me test out some of these areas and follow exactly in my footsteps." With her careful movements, they managed to make their way safely to the bottom of the stairs. Once through, they noticed that the left path saw much more traffic than the right. Feeling vindicated in their choice, the party moved to the left. After moving through the apparent garden of fungus, the party made their way to an area where the fungus was patchy at best, with most of the floor being bare, except for several dead bats. Cora stopped and put a finger to her lips, and then pointed up once she had everyone's attention. The ceiling of this part of the cave was covered by a large amount of bats. She pantomimed sneaking, and one by one, everyone nodded their agreement. Sadly, however, her pantomimes were for naught. Flintfinder accidentally kicked a helmet that was left on the floor for some reason, and sent it into a nearby pillar, which caused a very loud noise to ring out in the quiet space. The bats took flight, clearly startled by the noise, and they drowned out all other sounds and made it very difficult to hear. At least until everyone heard Cora yell, "Get off me! Sturges! There are sturges!" As usual, Garrett was the first to act. He tried to strike with his sword at one of the sturges as they flew around among the bats, but he just couldn't get a clear thrust. Eventually, he just settled for grabbing one out of the air as it flew by and slamming it into the ground, where it crumpled, not moving. Tess was next to attempt to attack, but her greatsword only managed to temporarily free areas from bats. The sturges were able to fly around her sword with ease. One of the sturges attempted to spear Mara with its proboscis, but she dove to the floor out of its path. The second sturge went after Garrett, sticking him and sucking out some of his blood. Before he could react, it had detached itself, apparently filled, and flew off. Flintfinder shot out a thrust with his sword with a speed and precision that even managed to put Garrett's grabbing of a sturge out of midair to shame. With another thrust, this time from his short sword, he managed to take out a second sturge. Morn shot a mote of fire toward the last remaining sturge, but at the last second, a bat flew into the path of the spell, and it was burned up. Cora also sent out a mote of fire, and was more successful than Morn was, hitting their target. After a few moments of calm as the group moved as little as possible, the bats finally settled back down and went back to roosting on the ceiling. At which point, the group beat a hasty exit toward the next area, which just happened to have a trash heap. Seeing several shiny things, a couple of the party members jumped down into the mess to try and see what they could find in this dead-end section of the cave. After a few minutes of searching, Flintfinder stood up with his arms raised in triumph, and in his hand was a small pouch with a little over a dozen gems in it. "We will get these appraised later, but for now, I think we should be done with this trash. It is clear that most of the shiny things here are useless." Thank you so much for listening to episode 13 of Hoard of the Dragon Queen. Tune in tomorrow for my Friday show, and tune in Saturday for the next chapter of A Study in Scarlet.